The static on the phone line crackles like old paper burning. I always answer on the first ring now, even though I know what's waiting for me on the other end. The voice is familiar, impossibly familiar, speaking words that shouldn't exist anymore. It's my mother, calling from somewhere time forgot, her voice carrying messages from decades that have already slipped away into memory. My name is David, and for the past 6 months, I've been receiving voicemails from my mother. This might not sound unusual, except for one small detail. She died 3 years ago. The calls started arriving without warning, each one time-stamped from a different decade, each one a window into moments I never knew existed. The first voicemail arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, and when I pressed play, I heard her voice as clear as if she were standing right next to me. Let me tell you about the night it all began. I was sitting in my kitchen, scrolling through my phone after another long day at the office, when I noticed the notification. One new voicemail. The number showed up as unknown, but something about it felt different. The digits seemed to shimmer on my screen, like they were written in water. I almost deleted it without listening, the way you do with most unknown calls these days. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way the timestamp kept changing every time I looked at it, or maybe it was the strange pull I felt, like gravity was working in reverse. I pressed play, and the world shifted. Her voice poured through the speaker, warm and alive and impossible. It was my mother, but not the mother I remembered from her final years. This was her voice from somewhere else, somewhere when. The background noise told its own story. I could hear the distant sound of a rotary phone being dialed, the mechanical clicking that belonged to another era entirely. There was music playing somewhere in the background, something with strings and brass that sounded like it was floating through the air from an old radio. The message itself was simple, almost mundane. She was talking about making dinner, about how she'd found a new recipe for pot roast that she wanted to try. She mentioned the weather, how spring was coming early that year, but there was something in her tone, something that made my skin prickle with recognition and impossibility. This wasn't the mother I'd known in her 70s, worn down by years and illness. This voice belonged to someone younger, someone who still believed the future held endless possibilities. I played the message 17 times that first night, sitting in my dark kitchen while the world slept around me. Each time I caught new details, the way she laughed when she mentioned burning the biscuits, the sound of what might have been a television in the background, playing some program I couldn't quite identify, the casual way she said goodbye, as if she expected to talk to me again soon, as if death hadn't already claimed her and buried her under 6 feet of Minnesota soil. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone clutched in my hand, like a lifeline. Part of me wondered if I was losing my mind, if grief had finally pushed me over some invisible edge I hadn't known I was walking. But the message was there, recorded and real, time-stamped at 11:47 the night before. I could play it again if I wanted to. I could prove to myself that it had actually happened. The second call came 3 days later. This time, the timestamp showed a date from 1973, and her voice sounded even younger. She was excited about something, talking rapidly about a movie she'd just seen. I recognized the title. It was a film I knew she'd loved, one she'd mentioned to me years before she died. But hearing her talk about it as if she'd just walked out of the theater, her voice bright with fresh enthusiasm, made my chest tight with something between joy and terror. That's when I started keeping a notebook. I wrote down every detail I could remember about each call, the timestamps, the background sounds, the things she talked about. I tried to piece together a timeline to understand what was happening to me. The calls seemed to be coming from different periods of her life, scattered across decades like breadcrumbs, leading back through time. The third call arrived on a Sunday morning, and this time I was ready. I had my notebook open, my pen in hand. The timestamp showed 1968, and when I played the message, I heard something that made my blood turn cold. She was crying, not the quiet tears I remembered from her later years, but the raw, broken sobs of someone much younger. She was talking to someone I couldn't hear, someone who must have been on the other end of whatever conversation this was. Through her tears, I caught fragments of words. Something about a letter, about news that had changed everything. The sound quality was different too, tinnier somehow, as if the call was traveling through more than just space to reach me. There was static that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and beneath it all, a sound I couldn't quite identify. It might have been wind, or it might have been something else entirely. I started researching, diving deep into the internet's endless archives. I looked up phone technology from different decades, trying to understand how calls from the past could somehow find their way to my present. I read about electromagnetic anomalies, about time slips and quantum entanglement. I found forums where people shared their own impossible stories, tales of voices from beyond speaking through crackling phone lines and digital static. Most of the stories sounded like wishful thinking, grief transformed into fantasy, but some of them felt different. There was a woman in Oregon who claimed her grandfather called her every Christmas morning, 20 years after his death. A man in Florida who said his son left him voicemails from a future that hadn't happened yet. The details were always different, but the underlying experience was the same. Voices reaching across impossible distances, love finding a way to bridge the gap between what was and what is. The fourth call came with no warning, the way they all did. I was driving to work when my phone buzzed, and I had to pull over to listen. This time, the timestamp showed 1981, and my mother's voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. She was talking about being proud of someone, about watching them grow up and become the person she'd always hoped they would be. It took me several minutes to realize she was talking about me. But here's the thing that made my hands shake as I sat in my parked car. In 1981, I was only 7 years old. The things she was saying, the pride in her voice, it was about accomplishments that were still years in my future. She talked about my college graduation, about the job I'd eventually get, about choices I wouldn't make until I was well into my 30s. It was as if she could see the entire arc of my life spread out before her, as if time was just another dimension she could step through at will. That night, I called my Aunt Sarah, my mother's sister. Sarah was the only family I had left, the only person who might understand what I was going through. I told her about the calls, about the messages that couldn't possibly exist. I expected her to suggest therapy, to gently remind me that grief can play tricks on the mind. Instead, she was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and careful. She told me about something that had happened just after my mother's funeral. She'd been going through my mother's things, sorting through decades of accumulated memories, when she found a box hidden in the back of the bedroom closet. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me. But they weren't letters my mother had written and forgotten to send. They were letters she'd written to the me she imagined I would become at different stages of my life. There was a letter for my 16th birthday, one for my wedding day, one for when I had children of my own. Sarah said she hadn't known what to do with them. so she'd kept them, waiting for the right time to give them to me. The handwriting was definitely my mother's, but the paper looked old, as if the letters had been written years before my mother had actually lived through the events she was writing about. We met the next day, and Sarah handed me the box with trembling fingers. The letters were exactly as she'd described them, written in my mother's careful script on paper that felt ancient beneath my fingers. I opened the one marked for my 30th birthday, an age I'd reached just 2 years before my mother died. The letter talked about things she couldn't have known, conversations we'd had in private, decisions I'd made that I'd never shared with anyone. But it was the last letter that made my breath catch in my throat. It was addressed simply to David, with no age specified, no particular occasion marked. Inside, in my mother's handwriting, was a single sentence that made the world tilt sideways around me. It said, "I hope the phone calls help you understand that love doesn't end just because time does." That night, I sat by my phone and waited. The call came at exactly midnight, and this time, when I answered, I could swear I heard something different in the static. It sounded almost like breathing, like someone on the other end was waiting for me to speak first. The timestamp showed 1975, but my mother's voice sounded timeless, ageless, as if she was speaking from a place where years didn't matter anymore. She told me about a dream she'd had, about seeing me as an adult, about knowing somehow that I would be okay even when life got difficult. She talked about love as if it was a living thing, something that could grow and change and find new ways to express itself even after the body that housed it was gone. Her voice was gentle, the way it used to be when she would read me bedtime stories, and I found myself crying without knowing exactly why. The calls continued, each one a gift wrapped in impossibility. Sometimes she was young, her voice full of dreams and plans for a future she couldn't yet imagine. Sometimes she sounded older, wiser, as if she was calling from a time when she knew things she couldn't have known in life. The timestamps jumped around randomly. 1964, 1989, 1971, creating a mosaic of moments that didn't follow any logical sequence. I started recording the calls using an old cassette recorder I found in my closet. The quality was never perfect, but it was enough to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things. I filled notebook after notebook with transcriptions, trying to map the geography of these impossible conversations. Some calls lasted only a few seconds, just long enough for her to say my name and tell me she loved me. Others went on for minutes, long rambling stories about people I'd never met and places I'd never been. There was the call where she talked about meeting my father for the first time, her voice bright with the memory of new love. There was another where she described holding me as a baby, the weight of me in her arms, and the way I would stop crying whenever she sang. She talked about Christmases I remembered and Christmases I didn't, about birthday parties and scraped knees, and the time I got lost in the grocery store when I was 4. But it was the calls from the later timestamps that affected me the most. These were the ones where her voice carried the weight of years, where she talked about getting older and watching me grow up and move away. In one call from 1997, she talked about being proud of the man I'd become, about knowing that she'd done her job as a mother even if she worried sometimes that she hadn't done enough. In another call, time-stamped just 3 months before she actually died, she talked about not being afraid. Her voice was weak but steady, and she told me about dreams she'd been having, about seeing people she'd lost long ago, waiting for her somewhere bright and warm. David stared at the phone, its silence now more haunting than any ringtone could ever be. The letters from his mother lay scattered across his coffee table like fallen leaves, each one a piece of time that shouldn't exist, each word written in her familiar handwriting that somehow looked both ancient and immediate. 3 days had passed since the last call, and the quiet felt wrong, unnatural, like holding your breath underwater. He'd been carrying one of the letters with him everywhere, the paper soft from handling, the ink slightly faded but still legible. It was dated 15 years in the future, written in his mother's hand but describing a world he couldn't yet imagine. She mentioned grandchildren he didn't have, spoke of a garden she'd never planted, referenced conversations that existed only in the space between what was and what might be. The calls had been coming for 2 weeks now, each one from a different decade of her life. Sometimes she sounded 19, her voice bright with possibility, talking about dreams she'd had for her future son. Other times she was 67, the age she'd been when she died, her voice carrying the weight of years lived and wisdom earned. But it was the calls from times that hadn't happened yet that unsettled him most, where she spoke with the certainty of memory about events that were still waiting to unfold. David had stopped questioning the logistics of it all. How could a dead woman call from decades that spanned both past and future? How could her voice travel through time like radio waves bouncing off the atmosphere? The rational part of his mind had given up trying to solve the puzzle, surrendering instead to the strange comfort these conversations brought. His mother's love, it seemed, operated outside the normal rules of existence. The phone company had no record of the calls. Friends who were with him when they came heard only silence, watching him speak to empty air with a mixture of concern and bewilderment. But David heard every word, felt every pause, recognized every inflection that had shaped his childhood. The conversations were real in ways that transcended proof. Tonight felt different, though. The apartment held a stillness that seemed to press against his skin, and David found himself checking the phone every few minutes, willing it to ring. He'd grown addicted to these glimpses into the continuity of love, these proof-of-concept calls that suggested something in the universe refused to let connection end just because a heart stopped beating. When the phone finally rang at 11:43, David's hand was already reaching for it. Her voice carried the warmth of summer afternoons, somewhere between the mother who'd packed his school lunches and the woman who'd held his hand during his father's funeral. "Mom," he breathed, settling into his chair like sliding into a familiar embrace. "I'm calling from 1987, she said, and David could hear the smile in her voice. "You're 12, and you just lost your first tooth. You were so proud, showing everyone at dinner, wiggling it with your tongue." David remembered. The tooth fairy had left him $2, an astronomical sum that had made him rich beyond his 12-year-old dreams. But more than the money, he remembered the way his mother had saved the tooth in a small wooden box, telling him that some things were too precious to throw away. "I still have that box," she continued, and David's breath caught because he knew she was telling the truth. He'd found it among her things after the funeral, a collection of tiny treasures that documented his growing up in fragments of lost teeth, first drawings, report cards with gold stars. "I kept everything," she said softly. "Every drawing you made, every card you gave me, every photo where you weren't quite looking at the camera. I kept them because I knew, even then, that love creates its own kind of archaeology." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, her voice weaving between different versions of herself, different moments in time. She spoke about his first day of school, how she'd cried in the car after dropping him off. She mentioned his college graduation, describing the pride that had filled her chest when she watched him walk across that stage. She talked about quiet Tuesday evenings when nothing special happened, but they'd sit together watching television, and she'd felt the simple contentment of having her son nearby. "Time isn't linear the way we think it is," she said, near the end of the call. "Love creates its own geography, its own physics. I'm calling you from every age I ever was, every moment I ever loved you, because that love doesn't disappear when the body stops working." David pressed the phone closer to his ear, trying to absorb every word, every pause, every breath. "But Mom," he said, "how long will this last?" There was a silence that stretched long enough for David to worry the connection had been lost. Then her voice returned, softer now, tinged with something that might have been sadness or might have been peace. "I don't know, honey. Time works differently here, wherever here is. But I want you to understand something important. These calls, they're not just for you, they're for me too. Death isn't an ending, it's a translation." She paused, and David could hear something like wind in the background, or maybe it was the sound of years passing. "The letters you found, the ones I wrote to myself across the decades, I wrote those because I knew, somehow, that love needed documentation, evidence, proof that it had existed, that it would continue existing." David looked at the letters scattered around him, understanding now that they weren't just correspondence between past and future versions of his mother. They were love letters to possibility itself, written by a woman who understood that the heart's deepest truths required their own form of time travel. "I need you to do something for me," she said, her voice taking on the gentle authority he remembered from childhood. "I need you to write your own letters, not to me, but to the people you love who are still with you." The idea settled into David's chest like a seed finding soil. "Love is the only thing that gets stronger when you give it away," she continued. "It's the only currency that multiplies when you spend it. These calls, these letters, they're not about holding on to the past." As the call began to wind down, David felt the familiar ache of impending goodbye. But this time the sadness was mixed with something else, something that felt like understanding. He asked, "You hear from me every time you show kindness to someone who needs it," she said. "Every time you forgive when forgiveness seems impossible. Every time you choose love over fear, even when fear feels safer. I'm in all of those moments, David." The line grew quiet, and David could feel the call preparing to end, the strange technology of love and time beginning to power down. He said quickly, "Thank you for all of it, for loving me across time, for finding a way to reach me when I needed it most." Her laugh was soft and warm, the sound of summer rain on leaves. "Oh, honey," she said, "thank you for giving me someone to love. Thank you for making me a mother." The phone went quiet, but this time the silence felt different. Not empty, but full. Not an absence, but a presence that had learned how to exist in new forms. David sat holding the phone for a long time, understanding, finally, that these calls weren't about communication between the living and the dead. They were about recognizing that love itself is a form of eternal life, that every act of caring creates ripples that move forward through time, touching lives and moments that haven't even happened yet. The last calls came during winter, when the distance between worlds grows thin. Her voice, now carrying the weight of decades, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She spoke of watching me grow up, of moments I'd forgotten, but she somehow remembered. The future messages were the most haunting, describing events that hadn't happened yet but felt inevitable when they did. I realized then that these weren't just random communications from beyond. They were proof that love creates its own physics, bending time and space to reach us when we need it most. Each voicemail was a thread in a tapestry that spanned decades, connecting every version of her to every version of me. The final message came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Her voice was young again, maybe 25, full of hope and dreams. She talked about the son she would have someday, how she would love him completely, how that love would never die. She promised to find ways to reach him, to remind him he was never truly alone. When the message ended, I understood something profound. These calls weren't interruptions to my grief. They were invitations to heal. Love doesn't end with death. It transforms, finding new ways to express itself across the impossible distances between what was and what is. The phone hasn't rung since that last message, but I'm no longer waiting for it. I carry her voice with me now, in the quiet moments when I need guidance, in the laughter that sounds like hers, in the way I love others with the same fierce devotion she showed me. Some connections transcend time itself, creating bridges between yesterday and tomorrow, between the living and the eternal.